The challenge that we kind of have to grapple with is that the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve's independence is really crucial to the role that it's able to play in the economy as a stabilizer. So when the Federal Reserve makes decisions, it has two things in mind. It has what does the employment picture look like and what does inflation look like? And it's reacting to those two particular, really substantive data questions. If you're in a universe where instead a Federal Reserve that's become politicized is reacting to what President Trump thinks that the interest rates should be, well, in that situation, you kind of break the relationship between what the Federal Reserve actually gets to set, which is the federal funds rate, the rate at which banks lend to one another, and things like mortgage rates or car loan rates or small business loan rates that are like actually relevant to consumers in this economy. So perversely, by sort of trying to push so aggressively for an interest rate that is way outside of the realm of what any economic observers think makes sense in an environment where employment is basically at 4-ish% and inflation is still not back to target and in fact ticking upward because of this tariff policy, you really don't have any case to make for those type of rate choices outside of just politicization of the Federal Reserve, which comes with real risks.
I'm also hoping, Natasha, that you can give us a little bit more context here, too, because we have to keep in mind that the Fed chair is only one vote on the Federal Open Market Committee. And we did speak to Bill Pulte, the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, who told us earlier this week on Balance Power that they are seeking for Powell to step down as chair, but also his position on the board. Can you just give us a little bit, could this complicate the administration's ultimate goal here when you do have other members who are voting and what we are hearing from those other members when it does come to the future of rate cuts?
And, you know, it's like really important for your viewers, I think, and listeners to understand, like, there is no sort of button that the Fed chair pushes to change the interest rate. The way that it works, as you're describing, is the Federal Reserve chair is one of 12 members on the Federal Open Markets Committee that makes decisions. They meet 8 times a year. They make decisions on the trajectory of the interest rate. And importantly, these are decisions that are made by a group of people. And so the Fed chair, even if the president was effective at getting a Fed chair in who was going to push for his desired rate cuts that he's sort of trying to effectuate from the top in ways that break Federal Reserve independence, well, the rest of the board is going to be in a situation, and the rest of the committee is going to be in a situation where they're actually trying to push against exactly that impulse because they want to preserve the independence of the Federal Reserve, both because they are sort of institutionally very concerned about it, but also because only then can we be in a situation where we are actually trusted and credible as being reactive to inflation and being reactive to the employment picture. And what's important for your viewers, listeners also to understand is, like, we in some sense have run this experiment before. Like, President Nixon put a ton of pressure on the Federal Reserve to cut rates in ways that would be short-term politically expedient. They did. And as a result of that, you saw inflation tick up from 3% to 13% over the course of 2 years in ways that required a massive course correction and led to a significant downturn. So, like, I don't think anyone should be rooting for that in this country. And it certainly goes against what the Trump administration is hoping to see from an economic perspective.
Yeah, the historical context is important to keep in mind here, Natasha, and I appreciate you pointing that out. As you talk about the idea of trust and credibility for the Federal Reserve, I also wonder about the trust and credibility of the president as we consider his very frequently changing deadlines when it comes to tariff and trade policy, because this is what the Fed is having to contend with, why it makes their decision making perhaps so hard. How do you at Budget Lab even try to game out the tariffs and the likely revenue we are going to be getting from them when the deadlines keep moving and the numbers keep changing? Is it even really possible to model?
I mean, we are doing our best. My colleagues and I at the Budget Lab are sort of tracing every single twist and turn with respect to tariff policy in this country. And, you know, to our count, we've seen the effective tariff rate change like almost 60 times over the course of the last several months as a result of the president's different political policies that have been pursued in this trade war. The thing that I think is like really important to grapple with, and you heard actually Governor Waller say a version of this, you've heard Chair Powell will say a version of this as well. The president's been like super specific. He would like to see interest rates lower. Sort of Chair Powell and the rest of the Fed have been pretty specific as well, that in a world in which this sort of uncertainty associated with trade policy didn't exist, the Federal Reserve would have already cut. And so you're in a world where it is hard in some sense to even game out what exactly the tariffs are meant to be for. Are they tools for revenue raising? Are they sort of important in order to balance our strategic alignment with vis-a-vis an adversary like China? Are they really about bringing manufacturing back into the United States? And the result of that is no one, you, I, and certainly not the business community, has any sense where these tariffs are actually fundamentally going to land. And that creates a difficulty that we can disagree about what the right effective tariff rate should be in the economy, but certainly this sort of start-stop that makes it impossible really to plan with any sense of where policy is ultimately going to land makes it really challenging to think, as an estimator, certainly very challenging to think about what the likely revenue consequences are going to be. But certainly as a business trying to make investment decisions makes it incredibly complicated to think about that as well.
Natasha, just in our final minute, I want to build off of this because we did see Michigan consumer sentiment for July today come in above estimates. What are we learning when there is uncertainty, though, about the consumer's tolerance here, since confidence at one point was plunging amid tariff concerns, but today's data did show it at a 5-month high?
You know, I think it's really hard to make too much out of any one particular data point. We also got data this week about inflation that showed that in certain particular industries, if you look at things like consumer electronics, or if you look at things like household furnishings, which is a category that includes furniture, industries or sub-industries where the tariffs are likely to have substantial bite, you're starting to see an uptick in prices. I don't want to make too much of any one particular data point other than to tell you that the result of our estimates at Yale Budget Lab, which are trying to stay current with respect to where the president says tariffs are going to be come August 1st, this next deadline, is that consumers are going to see a $2,800 on average decrease in their in their household income as a result of higher prices. And for the bottom of the distribution, that's on top of something that you all have been talking a great deal about, which is these important cuts to social programs like Medicaid that have been recently effectuated. So I think there's a lot here that's pretty important.